to the 19th Century Charitable Association's Monday Enrichment Program. My name is Erin Payton, and I am the Executive Director of the 19th Century Charitable Association. Our mission is strengthening our community through learning, giving, and the sharing of our landmark building. We have a wonderful program for you today, and I hope you are all going to enjoy it. If something sparks your interest and you have a question or a comment, you can go ahead and type that into our Q&A or the chat section. And if there's time at the end of the program, I will unmute you, call you, unmute you, and you can ask the question directly to David. Well, again, enjoy the program. I'm going to bring on now Diane Moses.
David M. Sokol has had a 50-year career as a professor of art history and a museum professional. He earned his PhD at New York University, taught in New York City, and taught in the Department of Art History at the University of Illinois at Chicago from 1971 until he retired. He chaired the department for 17 years, becoming Professor Emeritus in 2002, and has taught American and European modern art and in a team-taught course on historic preservation. He directed the Museum Studies program at UIC for over 30 years. He also served as acting chair of the Department of Performing Arts at UIC, which included music, theater, and dance. He's an author of Oak Park, The Evolution of a Village, and The Noble Room, a monograph on Unity Temple. And thankfully, he is also a member of the 19th Century Charitable Association. Please give David a very warm virtual welcome.
The subject of American art and literature is one that's been quite dear to my heart because I ended up doing a doctoral dissertation on one of the artists we'll be looking at, John Quidor. I'd actually started out going to graduate school wanting to go into museum work and in the Italian Renaissance. But I happened to take a course in Rembrandt's prints at the print room of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was right across the street from our school. And I happened to, when they reopened their American wing, notice a painting there that struck my fancy. Found out there was very little art written about that artist. This was about 1964, and only one catalog had been written about him in 1942. So I ended up switching fields and dropped out of museology into the doctoral program, as opposed to most people doing it the other way. At any rate, here we are, and this is the work that has come to be a fascination to me. And I've enjoyed doing it and learning more about different artists and how they've worked. The subjects in the early part of this country, and even in the colonial period that most appealed, were portrait painting and landscape painting. And that related to the needs of a young and growing country. And it also related to the whole aspect of a hierarchy that had been established in the various academies, particularly in Europe, as to what was important. And what was important was portraiture, and what was important was so-called history painting. Now, history painting sounds like you're doing things from historical events, which is true, but you're also doing things based on literature, which related to historical events. And a lot of what we're going to be looking at today is of that particular group of works. Literature, in other words, being broadly defined from very close illustration of specific texts all the way to fanciful reinterpretations and recreations based on a text that may have been a historical event and which has been discussed in a more journalistic way. So let's go back and look at the beginnings of this. In the early years, not surprisingly, again, a lot of the works were biblically based, and particularly on the New Testament. Now, not all of the artists we know the names of, and it depends where they were in the country, as well as what level of training they had. So these first couple I'm showing you are religious paintings done in upstate New York, in essentially the area that was under Dutch control. And the facial types might look a little stereotypically Dutch/Flemish to those of you who recognize that. And the subjects are not handled with the greatest sophistication. This was probably a moderately trained to untrained artist who, though, took on these very traditional religious subjects. This one being On the Road to Emmaus. And then the next one being the Adoration of the Magi. Same area, possibly the same artist, and a very recognizable traditional subject matter, including the fact that this artist was taking one side of a tradition which represents one of the Magi as a black man. That was not always done. It was done in some traditions and not in others. So this is some of the kind of work we're finding even before the country was founded and in that particular part of the geography of the country. Benjamin West was the first fully trained artist who really made a mark in relationship to what became the developing new country. Although by the time he did this in 1777, he was no longer living here. He was an expatriate in England and was the second artist to become the president of the Royal Academy. He left here when he was 16 from Philadelphia, where he'd had his first training, went to England, and really never returned. Nonetheless, he always considered himself an American, and when King George III offered to knight him, he refused to take knighthood on the grounds that Americans did not accept these ranks. His subject here is, again, a very typically, well, not the most commonly well-known of subjects, but certainly one that is familiar with anyone who's reasonably conversant in their Bible. His Saul and the Witch of Endor. Saul, who is a very nervous young king and very insecure in his role, and he approaches the Witch of Endor to find out, after witches had been banned, to find out what's going to happen to his kingdom, and is revealed to him, of course, what's going to happen, that King David, no relation, is going to wrest the kingdom from him. But he is an important figure, not only in terms of doing his own art, but as a teacher of many other artists, young Americans who came to England both before, during, and after the Revolutionary War to study with him. Another subject, Moses showing the Promised Land of 1801. Again, those of you who sort of know your Bible, Moses did not enter the Promised Land. After the wandering in Egypt, he was forbidden. That God said to him, because of his various sins, like smiting the rock that he was supposed to speak to, he was not going to enter the Promised Land, but he could see it. And so that is the subject of this particular painting. I'm sorry, this one is a little blue, and I have to say some of the slides are off just because of deterioration over a period of time. John Singleton Copley, Boston artist, who again left this country. He, because he married into one of the very wealthy loyalist families of Boston, and he ended up doing all kinds of paintings that you probably have seen. His portrait of Henry Pelham, for example, his portrait of Paul Revere, Those are very well-known works, but that's not what we're here to talk about. He also took on subjects like this, mythological subjects. Things are loosening up, and it's not just religious ones, although he does some of those as well. Here, Galatea being escorted by the nymphs and dryads and sea folk to her triumph. 1754, when he was a very young artist, and probably copied this after a print by an English artist. And if I was giving a whole course, I would be showing you that, but we just don't have the time for it. One of his most famous paintings, other than his portraits, is his Watson and the Shark, of which there are 3 versions, one vertical, 2 horizontal. And this is a historical subject, but it was so widely mentioned in newspapers and in journals and everything that the painting could be legitimately considered to be a literary subject. It actually took place not in Boston Harbor, not in Britain, but in Bermuda Harbor, where this Watson fell out of the boat, and the shark is after him, as we see, and this heroic young man manages to stab the shark and kill it after the shark had taken a sizable chunk of Brooke Watson's leg. Interestingly enough, again, for a work of 1778, and I don't have a detail of it, or at least I'm not technologically proficient to show you how to get to that, but you can see in the back is a rather heroic figure of a young African-American man. In the early 19th century, it was trying to recognize that we all too often show the history only of the British settlement of this country. We have to remember that there was a good sections of the country, both in the beginning and later on, where other cultures, other countries had had impact. We already actually saw a little bit of the Dutch impact of the upstate New York area. Well, of course, swaths of the Southwest were under and came under Spanish control, and ties to Mexico. And here we see a flight into Egypt of the early 19th century, an unidentified artist, where we see Mary holding the Christ child on the donkey and so forth, and in a rather flat setting and rather limited artistic license, but it has a certain charm and balance, and it certainly shows us the kind of things that also are being done. Another work, biblically based and from another part of the country by an anonymous artist. I'm sorry, I just realized I added an extra M to Adam. Well, probably considering this is Pennsylvania Dutch, so the Germanic double M possibly makes sense. An early 19th century work that shows, well, the temptation of Eve, who's reaching up to get the apple from the serpent, while Adam reaches across for her. And it's in a newspaper setting and the German text around it. But this is, again, there was a whole body of work, both sophisticated and more rudimentary, that was being done, again, under different cultural and artistic traditions. Washington Allston was one of the first major fully trained artists in this country, who had attended Yale, where his father, Jedediah Morse, was a major figure as a minister. And he went to England, hung around with West a little bit, and then came back and started taking on a whole pile of much more romantic subjects. I should say more romantic treatments of subjects. They were often the same kind of religiously based subjects as other artists had, but now instead of having classical balance and so forth, we have much more dramatic and romantic setting, as you can see here. The subject being Elijah in the wilderness, and we see the tiny form of Elijah in almost the lower center, and a raven up on the branches who's going to be feeding him and stopping him from starvation. Now, this is therefore a basic literary subject, but we have to admit we could remove the figure of Elijah very easily and say we have a dramatic landscape. So here he's sort of playing both sides of the street and fully embracing the showing of nature, the dramatic sky, the barren treatment of the desolate landscape. On the other hand, he also took on subjects like this and does treat them in a much more balanced, classical, and of course stage-like setting, because it's a scene from a play, from one of Shakespeare's plays, The Taming of the Shrew. And we can see things like the lines converging in space of traditional perspective that shows Allston being a much more sophisticated artist than the others we have looked at, very much aware of classical traditions, and so forth. You don't probably think of Samuel Morse as an artist, but Samuel Finley Breeze-Ross was a very important artist and the first longtime president of the National Academy of Design. You may be aware of, certainly those of us in Chicago, the large painting of the Gallery of the Louvre that was owned by the Terra Foundation, which is now sits at the Art Institute of Chicago. I was the curator of the Terra Museum at the time that was purchased, and it was certainly a lot of fun getting involved with it. But Morse did all kinds of paintings, including mythological subjects like this, 1812, the Dying Hercules. It's not as clear as some of the others I'd like to be able to show you. And I think you'll be able to notice some of the unclearest ones are very small. And that's because I already stretched them a bit from the way I was able to load them on. But this is a sort of a typical subject, which has often been portrayed in sculpture as well. But this is Morse's treatment of the Dying Hercules. Another one he did, the Judgement of Jupiter. Here a more mythological based subject, 1815. He is aware of, again, his mythology. He had a classical training and a very good, solid education. Again, his father was a major figure and America's first major geographer, as well as someone who tried to negotiate treaties with the Indians in a fair way. Not that he had much success. But so here is a person who is very widely knowledgeable and does religious subjects, does mythological subjects, does portraits, and so forth as well. But here we're taking a look at his literary-based ones. William Sidney Mount, I think I'm just showing you this one work. Again, Saul and the Witch of Endor, the subject which we've seen already. Here we see Saul pointing to the witch and someone else realizing what's going on and looks horrified at what is occurring. So Mount was particularly known as a genre painter. All his scenes of American life on the river, in and around Long Island, his things of racial relationships and so forth are what he's famous for, but he did start out in his early career doing such religiously and literary-based subjects as this. Another subject we've seen before is the Garden of Eden, and at least Adam and Eve in some way. Here is Thomas Cole's large treatment of both the Garden of Eden as this lush, green Eden, contrasting it with the much more violent, angry, pallid, lacking in color of the world outside. And we see the tiny figures of Adam and Eve having just come through the gate and the archangel is there at the gate with the flashing sword to make sure neither they nor anyone else can ever return. Now, Cole was America's great early landscape artist and the founder of the Hudson River School of Landscape, but he also took on a lot of religious and mythological art. Here's, again, a mythological subject where, just like with the religious subject of Allston, the figure is comparatively tiny. Prometheus, as you may know from your mythology, is bound up against a rock, and he is there forever while birds of prey, and we have one coming up from the bottom rocks, go out and tear out his liver every day and torture him, and then it rebuilds, regenerates, and it happens again the next day for his taking on the anger of the gods. So Cole did a number of works along these lines. But I'm really here to show you his real introduction to the major threads of American literary painting. And those gather around two particular writers. There was still going to be a lot of attention paid to both Bible, mythology, and major established European writers, certainly whether Shakespeare or others. But two American writers had come on the scene by this time that would have a tremendous impact on art, and many of these artists are going to either illustrate their books or, like in these large paintings, using those stories or novels as the basis of the subject. And the first of those two is James Fenimore Cooper. And here Thomas Cole takes a scene from The Last of the Mohicans in 1827, and he shows this scene where the whole tribal area is gathered around. And we know the subject is there, and if we get close, we can tell more about it. But again, he is using this to a large extent as an excuse for introducing landscape painting and the dramatic views of nature that he found around him, not only in upstate New York, but going up into New England as well. So it's clearly an autumn scene, and we see the coloring of the leaves and so forth. John Quidor, the artist I mentioned, who I had done my dissertation on, also took on subjects from The Last of the Mohicans and other things from the whole Leatherstocking series, Natty Bumbo, and so forth. And here, his paintings are quite different than Cole. His view of nature is a little different. He brings the scenes a lot closer. It's probably more clearly influenced by Dutch 17th century paintings, which he probably knew through engravings. But what's different is you get the level of humor now. And the humor is really pretty much condescending, sarcastic, in the same way that Cooper's writings were, as were Washington Irving's also, and which made fun of the pretensions of the settlers, and particularly of the Dutch in favor of seeing the English as being superior. So here, Leatherstocking's rescue. One of the daughters is supposed to be attacked by this puma, a mountain lion kind, and Leatherstocking, standing over there, manages to kill the animal. One of the sisters is merely swooning. She has not been bitten. She's not been fully attacked. And the other sister is, lamenting over her and bosom heaving with passions. Another one of his Leatherstocking series, Leatherstocking Meets the Law. The law comes in to inspect to see what Leatherstocking has in there, and Leatherstocking comes out and chases him off his property along with another sheriff type person in no uncertain terms, while a sidekick sits there laughing at what he does with the law. So this is not only making fun, but it also is sort of some of the early parts of the American sort of anti-law, if you will, gun rights. Each man is home is his castle kind of thinking and way of representing that. One of the subjects that became very popular among many of the artists were from the short stories of Washington Irving. And Irving became even more popular subject than Cooper. Cooper had his series of novels and a few essays. But of course, Irving's advantage is that he had a few major books, as well as his Knickerbocker History of New York, which Quidor did a lot of paintings based on. And by the way, never did a book illustration. None of the zillions of sets of editions of Washington Irving's works ever have illustrations by Quidor, although it has it by some of the others. But Quidor studied with John Wesley Jarvis, as did Henry Inman here. And Henry Inman gives you a painting. He did a few of this subject of Rip Van Winkle. And you can see he's waking from his long sleep with a full beard and sort of wondering sort of what happened to him. Sticking with that subject, though, Quidor starts us off with the earlier view, and we see Rip Van Winkle seen at the village tavern. And leaning against the tree, somewhat indolently, is the young Rip Van Winkle. And he's sort of looking like, oh, I don't care, somewhat isolated from all the good fun that these Dutch burgers and people who hang around the tavern are enjoying. And this is really quite satirical. One guy is whispering in the ear of another old man, throws his leg over him, which is usually a sexual motif. Others are whispering, drinking. A young woman is sitting there sort of drunk in the entranceway, and another one is blowing smoke at her. Excuse me. And we see a picture of King George up there. However, he returns to the subject, and we get the return of Rip Van Winkle. It's sort of this, and these two bracket the subject that we saw Inman did of Rip Van Winkle awakening. Here, Rip returns after his long 20 years sleep. He comes into the village, and who is he pointing at? A young Rip, his son, the now young, indolent son, who's in the mirror image leaning against a tree of the way his father was in the previous painting. But again, you have these wretched little urchins making fun of him, looking and leering, people astonished, very boorish. And again, he's making fun of the peasantry and so forth. If you can see on the bracket overlooking, coming out of the house or the tavern, there is a picture, but now it is George Washington. One of Quidor's students, with the remarkable name of Albertis del Orient Browere, did a lot of genre subjects, but also took on the subject of the return of Rip Van Winkle. And we can see how it's somewhat similar. Excuse me. It's somewhat similar in the terms of showing Rip returning and the young son over there. The housing is actually very clearly Dutch oriented. If you've ever been to Amsterdam, you'll recognize that big hook coming out of the top floor, the way they'd lift the furniture into the apartments and so forth. So again, the same kind of heavy-handed humor, but these subjects were very popular among affluent collectors and often made into prints for less moneyed folks. One of the artists who did do these as book illustration was Felix Octavius Darley, who was one of the most successful illustrators of the middle of the 19th century. He and Thomas Nast, who did much more political work, were the ones who really sewed up getting illustrations in magazines and newspapers of both topical subjects and ones based on literature and history. And Darley did quite a few on the subjects of Irving and Cooper, particularly again Irving. So once again, we have Rip Van Winkle here now as an old man, returned from his long sleep, sitting there leaning forward with his long beard, looking in and telling his stories to all the people who hang around the tavern, who pay either lesser or greater amounts of attention depending upon their mood as he rattles on in his old age about what had happened to him. The other great subject of popularity for many of these artists, and taken from Irving, was of course the story of Ichabod Crane and Katrina Van Tassel. And here we have the young Ichabod Crane dancing with the buxom young Katrina Van Tassel at her father's mansion. And he's cutting quite a rug there, as you see. It's sort of a very enjoyable. They have a fiddler over there and all having a very good time. But as we all know from that very well-known story, it doesn't end well for for Ichabod, who is chased off by Brom Bones. And here we see him pursued by the Headless Horseman as Ichabod, as he departs, never to be seen again. And the Headless Horseman is about to throw the head at him, which frightens him. Of course, it turns out they find just a squashed pumpkin. That was what Brom Bones was doing to him to get rid of his competition for the fair Katrina. And here's another Darley, the lady of his heart, showing the lovesick young Ichabod, and the very demure in this case, rather than dancing away Katrina Van Tassel. So these are illustrations that are paintings, but then were made into direct book illustrations for the editions, the new Sunnyside edition and the others of the collected works of Washington Irving. And that subject stays with people throughout a good part of the century. Back to Quidor a minute, and one of the other subjects from the Tales of the Traveler, if I recall correctly, is the story of the Devil and Tom Walker, which is a sort of brought down to earth treatment of the Faust legend, very brought down to earth. Here, Tom Walker is out in the woods. He has a skull. He's sort of scared, and he comes across this woodsman who is really the devil, and he makes the proverbial deal for riches, and in exchange he will sell his soul to the devil. I have to tell you, Quidor's style goes back and forth, and he treats these subjects both in his early, more controlled style, and then later on in these looser style as well. But you can't tell the subject and the style are not going to necessarily correspond. Here's the end of that story. The devil comes to get his due. Tom Walker is sitting in his counting house, and he says, I've come to collect. And Walker has his Bible there, and he tries to hang on to that as a way of keeping away the devil. And he says, when this person is trying to collect to postpone his mortgage, Tom Walker says, the devil take me if I give you any more time. And so the devil shows up, says, you're come for, Tom, throws him on the black steed, and where he's going to be taken off to hell. So, but again, very broadly done, a lot of humor, a lot of sarcasm implied in the stories. And that subject is taken on by other artists as well. Here's Charles Days, who actually is best known for his treatments of Western subjects, and he does the Devil and Tom Walker as well. Here's something a little different. We can't quite call it a literary subject, but it's a sort of a literary subject. Edward Hicks, who was a minister in the Society of Friends, he took the biblical injunction about the lion lying down with the lamb, and in the end of days, the peacefulness, and he combined it with treatments of Penn's treaty with the Indians. They were, in his mind, analogies of peaceful cooperation. I think the lambs had a better chance with the lions than the poor Indians did with William Penn, but be that as it may. Some of the more dramatic subjects based on literary sources are like this Conrad Wise Chapman, which is actually in the Capitol, the baptism of Pocahontas. Did that event really ever take place? We don't know, but they certainly wrote about it a lot in stories, and so he treats it as a literary subject here in a rather full, dramatic, sort of classical composition early in the, late in the 1830s. Daniel Huntington, a painter who did a lot of historical subjects. Again, this is sort of not a hardcore biblical book, but the kinds of books that were written and stories written about religious figures, and that he picks up on that and gives us this kind of work in a much more, again, classical medium. I'm going to skip to these two. Robert Duncanson, who I've shared the work of with you before in another talk on American landscape, and he was our first African-American artist of note, and he was a sort of follower of the Hudson River School, and here he translates, though, the subject of the Garden of Eden, as other artists did, seeing the comparatively unspoiled parts of the Hudson River Valley as the equivalent of an Eden. Sorry for the color on this, is not very good. William Rimmer, who did a lot of dramatic subjects, also did religious ones like Hagar and Ishmael of 1858, the biblical story of how because of the competition with Abraham's other wife, Hagar and her son Ishmael were forced out into the wilderness and became the origin of the Arab tribes. But a more traditional subject as well, Massacre of the Innocents, 1858 by him. His most interesting and well-known painting, though, is of a less clear subject. It is biblically based. It's called Flight and Pursuit. It's 1872. And what we have here is a subject that seems to be the captain of King David's army running to get sanctuary on the horns of the altar because of his crime. And if you were managed to make it into the temple and grab the horns of the altar, you were safe. But what is he safe from? From this fleeing figure? We really can't tell exactly what it is. And it's wildly romanticized, orientalizing of the temple in Jerusalem. So it's something there based on a traditional subject, but it is sort of interpreted in such a personal way, it's hard to tell. I sort of just put this in because of its topicality, and Currier and Ives did all kinds of subjects that were based on newspaper events and stories rather than on high literature. But I just thought we should take a look at one of those. John Lafarge, who is known for his stained glass windows in stained glass treatment in some of the great buildings, particularly Trinity in Boston. But he also did these large-scale religious paintings, which show a great sophistication and maturity of modeling light and dark and so forth, that shows his high degree of level of training and academic excellence. And he also did things like these little tablets, one of the biblical Ruth and Naomi, who are, of course, from the book of Ruth in the Jewish Bible. I'm going to skip those two because I'm running a little behind in time. And I'm going to bring us into the 20th century. N.C. Wyeth, the great book illustrator and magazine illustrator, who took on all kinds of literary subjects. He was well known for his doing both English literature and continental. Here he does Lancelot and Guinevere of 1922 for one of the whole editions of the Legends of King Arthur. He had his career was cut short when he was killed in a car accident, being hit by a train. He's also extremely well known for his work on Robinson Crusoe. And we have subjects like this, Long John Silver and Jim. And these are clearly much more basic illustration, comparatively simplified storylines, and so forth, some of which, of course, his son Andrew Wyeth picked up as well in a much more realistically modeled way. Well, Charles Birchfield, who's a landscape artist, actually takes on one of a very rare subject for him, Cain and Abel, the slaying of Abel here by Cain, in a very twistingly dramatic landscape that looks like it recalls all the way back to Allston of over 100 years earlier. Rockwell Kent did a lot of book illustration, mostly in prints, etchings, engravings, graphic work. Here is Captain Ahab with his peg leg from one of the editions, and I'm showing it to you right in, not the full scale piece, but in the edition of the book illustration itself. Ahab from Moby Dick. Grant Wood, I think everyone here knows American Gothic, but he did some really interesting paintings, some of which were, again, somewhat sarcastic. The Midnight Ride of 1931 is, of course, based on the poem, on the Longfellow poem, and on the historical event, which we don't know exactly how historical it was. Gives us this dramatic bird's eye view of looking at the subject. And sort of tied to his literary painting, Parson Weems' Fable. Now, there's no actual literary source, but what of course is Parson Weems is the guy who made up and invented the story of Washington chopping down his cherry tree and confessing. So we see a little old man, a little boy with a face in the powdered wig of Washington with his father and this tree that's filled with cherries, as Parson Weems takes off his opens the curtain, which has a string of cherries as well, to show you his story. Isabel Bishop, Dante and Virgil in Union Square, 1932. I'm using this sort of to introduce several things. She was primarily an urban scene person, done lots of things, particularly of women, sort of the visual equivalent of O. Henry stories, shop girls and so forth, sitting around on their lunch hour, brushing their hair, whatever. But she takes on the subject of Dante and Virgil, which is an important thing, of course, from Dante's Divine Comedy, which was a very important and popular subject throughout a good part of the 20th century, both in Europe and here, a lot of it being stirred on by World War II. And she was an important New York artist, but this is the only work she has that introduces a literary-based subject like that. Paul Cadmus, who had a very interesting career and really difficulties because he was one of the first really out gay artists who you can see the way he treats the figure of Adonis. The musculature, the tilt of the head and everything becomes almost a stereotype of a gay man. And he does other things, subjects that like show baseball players looking at each other with unconcealed longing. But here this is based on a true literary subject, and I'm showing you that. Here, a rabid cat's Moses in the burning bush, a woodcut. He did a number of works. He did a lot of the Art Deco stuff at the Century of Progress exhibition in Chicago. And he also did work for Frank Lloyd Wright in design work under a sort of pseudonym. Thomas Hart Benton, you think of his political subjects and so forth. We don't think of him taking on mythological and religious subjects, but he did. And a couple of them, both the religious and the mythological ones, are like this, showing dirty old men as peeping toms. In this case, Persephone, the story is being translated from ancient world of Greco-Roman society to some farmer who catches her taking off her clothes to go swimming. And another classical subject, and here's one of them that's a little fuzzy because of the way I blew it up. Achilles and Hercules, and Hercules is taking on his great job of taming this bull, but here he's dressed in jeans instead of a toga and setting it in the American West. A little more high literary subject. I must admit I know nothing about this artist, but the subject Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights, and he shows him up against this tree longing for what he is longing. And again, there are other subjects like this that are taken on by both Eichenberg and other artists illustrating great British classics. David Aronson takes on the subject of Christ as a Jewish artist, very interestingly, and presents subjects that are sort of in the story and in the tale, but that you never see them traditionally shown. You have this, you understand reading the New Testament, you understand the Gospels, Christ driving the money senders out and so forth, and therefore he's being raised in a Jewish household, but you never actually read about him putting on the phylacteries as part of the morning prayers, but he develops a story from within the story. And Clarence Carter, Jacob's Ladder, takes on a subject of biblical thing, but also interprets it in a much more personal and abstracted way. Leonard Baskin was known as a painter and a printmaker, and he did a lot of subjects based on Dante's Inferno. And here, this is one of the scenes from one of the cantos of the Inferno, and the serpents that wrap themselves around and torture the damned. He also takes on the subject of Judith with the head of Holofernes, another biblical subject that's reasonably well known and known for basically, and recently, a lot of attention done to the several subjects that were done of that subject by Artemisia Gentileschi and that have been shown in recent years. J.A. Adams, The Return of Miriam, again, a subject that is sort of in the story implied of Moses and Miriam, but you don't actually get a clear distinction of seeing Miriam returning from her exile. Jack Levine, known for his political subjects of political corruption and the political figures being tongue-in-cheek and hand in glove with politicos and crooks, but he takes on the subject of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden turning these into much more mature figures and massive nudes with the angel just the head, I mean, the tip of the sword as they are driven out of paradise. And we're getting up into the 1980s already. We have a long history, and of course, I'm giving you just the most scattered selection of works from many others and many other works by some of these same artists. Here's Jacques Levine again, King Saul. His fear, I think, shows through not as much as in with the Winds of Endor, but here he's a very insecure king. Reminds me of a recent political figure. Barry Moser, who did a lot of paintings and book illustrations. Here we have Dante and Virgil. Here they are shown at the bottom. You almost don't realize they're down there, that they're not just mountains. They're there as they are approaching and going into hell to see what's going on there. Also about 1980. And Martha Erlbacher, The Death of Orpheus, takes on a number of subjects and treats mythological subjects in a very personal and traditional way. Orpheus, of course, is killed by these women and makes him into a truly classical subject as they go to attack him. And a subject we happen to have a copy of this, of the print made of this, Danse Macabre. What she does is take the traditional subject of the four horsemen of the apocalypse and translates them into contemporary terms, chemical pollution, war, starvation, and overpopulation in the back, and shows Flora sitting there bemused while an angel of death explains the reality to her. So we're getting into a pretty negative and contemporary view of the world and its basic literary sources. But I thought I'd end with Robert Barnes' The Bath of Aphrodite, another subject of the 1980s. Aphrodite, of course, being a more positive figure than the one we were just looking at. So we have a really broad and long look at the different kinds of art that have been done here, all based on literature, sometimes with history based in, and sometimes with contemporary figures, which we didn't have the time to really get into. But I think that gives us a little bit of an introduction to a subject we might want to return to and look at some greater depth at another time. I thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to try and take any questions.
David, I have one question to ask you.
Yes.
You've obviously done a lot. You've been a professor and an author and a museum curator, and now you're on the board of the 16th Street Theater. So my question is, what from what you have done you are doing now, what do you most enjoy?
Sleeping.
All of that stuff.
Oh, I enjoy doing a lot of things. I'm also on the Historic Preservation Commission of Oak Park, and on the, actually recently, Senator Harmon appointed me to the State Supreme Court Preservation Commission. I do things with those.
If you had to pick one that's your favorite, what would you choose?
Looking at art, just looking about it and processing it for myself.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Diane. All right, we are going to see who we've got. Meg Herman has a few questions. Meg, I'm gonna unmute you and let you ask one of those questions.
So thanks, David, for a great presentation. There was one painting that was the Pennsylvania Dutch painting of Adam and Eve in the newspaper. and they were covered with spots and freckles. What did that have any special meaning? I've never seen any paintings with spots and freckles on Adam and Eve.
I think, unfortunately, that was just foxing on the paper. Yeah, I mean, this was an 18th century piece of newsprint. I'm afraid that's all you were seeing is rust stains.
That's kind of cool too, though. You know, you're getting to see.
Because it was not just on their bodies, it was around the paper as well.
All right. All right, Meg. I do have freckles though. So if someone wants to paint me, they would have lots of freckles to work with. All right, Agatha, what is your question?
Here I am.
Hey.
Sorry, didn't know how to do it. Thanks for an interesting presentation. I learned a lot. But I had a question. Do the artists who paint more modern art now, do they base it on literature, or is it sort of just painted on some other basis?
I assume you're talking about abstraction when you say more modern.
Abstract, or yeah, we really don't see a picture, or you don't see.
Some do, actually. If you look at much of the most contemporary art, it is figuratively based. There's been a tremendous return for it. That is a combination probably of feminism. It's also a combination of the emergence more of Hispanic and African American artists confronting their situations, their identities, and so forth. So a lot more of the art that's being done from a much wider constituency is looking at the world around them and often looking back to historical subjects and reinterpreting them in their own sight, just like in some way Martha Erlbacher was doing, taking, instead of seeing, war and a helmet and, so forth, the way Albrecht Dürer did it, turned it into these more contemporary features of the negative society in which she found herself. So I think you find a lot of that. There's also been a lot of mining as blockbuster, and this is just putting on a different museology act, as a lot of the blockbusters are absolutely prohibitive in cost for the insurance and shipping of multi-million-dollar works, that paint museums, even the most well-heeled ones, are not doing as much of that, and they're looking to their own collections and mining them, as the term is going, and they often are turning to young curators and young artists who are not curators to pick out things that speak to them today, and often including their more modern interpretations of it. So that's a somewhat lengthy answer to your question, but I think we're finding a lot more things that are calling forth both historical memories and looking at the art of the past.
Thank you. This is just I think it's a quick follow-up. Marianne P., I'm not going to unmute you only because for time on this one. She wants to know, kind of as a add-on, is any work being done for contemporary literature, Hemingway or Jack London, for example, or is a lot of the work older works of literature?
Well, I think that's interesting that Hemingway and Jack London are looked as contemporary. I think we're all showing our age here.
Yeah, that's a cool century ago at this point. Yeah.
Some, not much.
J.K. Rowling. Anything being painted about J.K. Rowling? She's contemporary. Or Elizabeth Berg.
I wouldn't know.
Okay.
I certainly think, well, yes, what is happening is, of course, you're getting a shift into graphic books and things like that, which are a whole new genre.
Yeah.
And just like you started getting Winslow Homer prints in newspapers and articles in the Atlantic in the Civil War, now we're getting the graphic novel and artists' books that are being created, one of a kind, that never existed before. And that's where they'll be more likely to be taking on more contemporary authors. And often the same author might do it with a partner or do it her or himself.
Well, that's a good point. Helene wants me to ask you, what's the story about the violin behind you?
It was my father's,
Oh,
and he was going to be a classical violinist. He was being trained when the Depression sort of put an end to that, as he was the youngest of four children with a single mother. And he played it. That's where I learned to love classical music. And I remember lying on the carpet in my parents' apartment in the Bronx and listening to him play Paganini and so forth. And then later on, he stopped, and I never found out why. And when he retired, my brother and I bought him a new bow, and he never played it. And then when he finally went into an assisted living place, he gave me the violin and asked me to sell it for my brother and I to split it. And I was having a problem because of who made it and blah, blah, blah. And we had some good friends here in Oak Park. And Lily Spiegelman was a psychiatrist, and we used to go to symphony with them. And one day I'm telling her about these problems. She said, David, I don't think you want to sell that violin. I said, you're right.
yeah.
My brother said, if you ever do it, you can give me half the money. And I hung it up here in my den.
Oh, that is a wonderful story. I've got little tear in each eye on that one. That's beautiful. Ed White has a question. Ed, I have just asked you to unmute.
Oh, I don't want to unmute Ed. He'll talk about
Hello, David.
How are you?
Great, great presentation. I was so surprised, and of course you picked them individually, but I was so surprised at what I would call the old-time religion themes in contemporary artists, all the way up to the 80s. And who would be the who would buy these paintings in effect? They're so, I don't want to say, I don't want to date myself, but they're so old. The religious themes, and I guess I'm also pointing out my Unitarianism, they're so, biblically related.
They are,
in the
but
20th century.
Some of them, of course, are interpreted in more modern ways and reflect the worldview of the artist as well as possibly some of the society around them. And they've mostly been bought by art collectors. They're not particularly hanging in churches or in ministers' offices. And some of them, again, are somewhat sarcastic. Some of them are very personal. When you look at the treatment of, Dante and Virgil is not religious, but I mean, in some ways it's up with an ancient sort of old world thing. And again, there's a spirituality that comes out in some of them. In some of them, it's a worldview, and some of them dig at contemporary religion. So I can't give you one answer, but it's primarily art collectors who are buying them.
And this might be tied in. I'm gonna, again, for time sake, Alan Fox says he was struck by how few nudes were in the American paintings compared to European work of a comparable age. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, two. One, I wasn't showing nudes per se. I was looking at the basis of the subject, and very few of those subjects would have any in it. Having said that, America has a very solid tradition of Puritanism, and nudes never sold very well. Photography nudes, by the way, have done land office business. And all you think is people like Mapplethorpe and so forth, and Georgia O'Keeffe. There were just a lot of people, photographers, who've done a lot more with the nude, but there's not been there were times until well into the 20th century where affluent members of the boards of museums would say, absolutely not.
Wow.
Not putting up any nudes.
Thank you. We have time for just a few more questions, but I'm really loving how engaged you all are with this. Let's see. Let's do Gil.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And I know there's a whole bunch you didn't get a chance to show us, but I'm wondering, is there any literary work from any time in history for which there is not an artistic interpretation, but should be?
It should be, in my opinion, well, that's a little too big, Gil, for me to handle off the top of my head. I mean, there's all kinds. First of all, I don't know, as hard as it is to believe, I don't know all the art that was ever done.
Or all the literature.
There's just, and a lot of things are in collections that, I've just never been exposed to. It's only more recently, with the invention of the web and so forth, that we're seeing a lot of the work that's buried in museums becoming available online and being able to be looked at and being able to be downloaded without paying, huge fees and so forth.
Mhm.
So I have no idea on a more systematic way what some things might have been illustrated and have gone out of favor. There might have been paintings that are sitting,
Right.
in obscure locations. I can certainly tell you when they did the exhibitions at the Art Institute about 2 or 3 years ago about Chicago artists, that there was a lot of stuff that even then they were still not bringing out, that both came out of Hull House and came out of the Southside Arts Center. And there were artists in there who were taking on literary and historical subjects, and they're just not in the public eye, and they're not in the public favor.
Do
the curatorial favor.
Do most art museums have an online catalog of like comprehensive 100% of what they have?
Very few would have any. I can't think any that would have. The only ones that would have 100% would be some very small ones.
Small ones,
The
yeah.
very small collections that manage to digitize them.
Do you think that's something that are they working on that? Do you
Yes,
think? Or they
all are working on it, but it takes tremendous amounts of time and resources. I just finished 10 years on the board of the Illinois State Museum. They have a fraction of it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery, the National Museum. I think one of the ones that has the most is possibly the National Portrait Gallery.
Okay.
And they have also, because they have a very direct function, people are often looking for a portrait of someone to illustrate an article for genealogical reasons that have very little to do with art. But again, it takes time. You need the work, and it's just very, very time consuming and very costly. And so it's a very slow process. And we're having to get past the issues of the profit motive, and museums that were used to charging for photography to be loaned for you to put in an article. Now it's open source.
Yeah.
Where's the money going to come from? There's just a lot of professional and financial issues that are involved with all this.
Wow.
But it's coming. It's coming.
It may be in another 10 or 15 years. Maybe.
I'll check back when I'm 85. I'm 70.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, we are going to do one more question. Again, I appreciate everybody's questions. We just haven't, we just don't have time to get to all of them. Barbara Rhodes?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Thanks, David. This was really interesting. I just wondered how the artists and their works who stayed in the classical traditions as the rest of the art world as the avant-garde of the art world was moving into expressionism and abstraction, how are their works valued in importance and monetary terms now?
Well, no simple answer to that one, Barbara, as there aren't to so many others, but there have been always at least two markets. My brother happens to be an artist, my younger artist. He has a bachelor degree of fine arts. He sold a lot of work and managed to live as an artist. his work was known to neither avant-garde artists nor the museums, but a number of galleries, often in shopping centers and whatever, around the country, sold his prints very, very well. It's very colorful, things of flower arrangements and cutesy scenes and whatever. And there's always been enough people, as we can tell from our political world, to take on different values and different traditions and to value certain things. So there are artists who are very traditional, who are doing very representational work, even super realistic. I'm just going to mention the dealer because I worked with her because she sold the work of a German artist that I've curated the estate for, Anne Long in Charleston. Her stable of artists are people who mostly studied at the Florence Academy, and I don't mean Florence, Alabama. I mean in Italy, and they are super realists and so forth, and they sell extremely well to well-heeled patrons who like it. Portraits and scenes and landscapes and still lifes. And there are others, and they sell and they make a living and they live as artists quite well. Others are doing extremely avant-garde work. Some artists are immediately in favor and selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more. And other people who I might see as very similar or even more competent have a little show here or there, and it just doesn't catch on. And some of it is the whole marketplace of dealers and contacts. I've given whole lectures and courses on things like the art market and how it works, and who does what with who, and I'd be happy to talk about some of that sometime too.
Can you give us the first name of your brother in case anyone wants to look him up?
Edward.
Edward
If you look in Who's Who in American Art, David Sokol, art historian, Edward Sokol, artist.
Oh, that's awesome. That is amazing. Is there any last comment you'd like to make before we wrap things up today, David?
You all stay healthy, please.
Oh, thank you. And you too, you and Sandra. Okay, well, on that note, I hope you do all stay healthy because we have 2 more amazing programs for the rest of December, the next 2 Mondays. We have a music program next Monday and a literature program the next Monday. So if you're looking for how you can register, just go to our website, www.19thcentury.org. If you want to help us keep putting on these amazing programs and bring people like David on board, you can give us a donation. You can do that as well at www.19thcentury.org. For everyone here, for David and Diane and all the members, I wish you a great day, and we'll see you next week. Bye.